Israel is building up forces for a potential ground invasion of Gaza City. Israel continues its bombardment of suspected Hamas targets in Gaza, while Palestinian militants fire more rockets into Israel. The Israeli military claims it has killed more than a dozen senior Hamas leaders. Gaza's health ministry says more than 120 Palestinians have been killed since Monday, including 31 children and 20 women. At least 8 Israelis have also died in the new wave of violence. CBS News foreign correspondent Imtiaz Tyab has more from Israel.
It's the heaviest bombardment of Gaza yet. Overnight, Israeli airstrikes pummeled the densely populated Palestinian territory. While on the ground, Israeli soldiers fired artillery shells from their positions along the separation wall, smashing Hamas tunnel networks. Thousands of Palestinians fled the assault, carrying whatever they could, with parents clinging on to their children. This woman says, the kids are all afraid. Even us adults who have been in war since our childhood are afraid. We cannot bear this anymore. Israel's relentless campaign was clouded with confusion after a military spokesperson told the international media on Thursday that its soldiers were, quote, on the ground in Gaza, then later saying they weren't. An apparent miscommunication, the Israeli media says, could have been part of a deliberate ploy to confuse Hamas. But it didn't slow Hamas's campaign of rocket fire. 1,800 have been fired at Israel since the conflict began. In the Israeli town of Serdot, where a 5-year-old child was killed in rocket fire on Wednesday, residents were calling for blood.
It's very, very difficult to live under these circumstances, and the government should wipe out Gaza, once and for all.
Israel is facing multiple fronts as violence continues to rage in the country's mixed Jewish and Arab towns in the worst communal fighting seen for decades.
Imtiaz Tyab joins me now from Tel Aviv. Imtiaz, welcome. What's the very latest you can tell us from there in Tel Aviv?
Hey. Yeah, I'm in Tel Aviv. I'm in the heart of the city on a Thursday night, which is their Friday night, their end of the week. And as you can see, it's a ghost town. This street would normally be full of thousands upon thousands of people. But given the state of play, if you will, people are at home. People are sheltering. People have fled the city. And that you can see that sort of in several places where many people have had to look for other places to shelter as this conflict sort of drags on. Of course, in the south, Hamas has been firing rockets throughout the day. And of course, Israel has been pounding Gaza. In fact, pounding Gaza with more force than we've seen since this began on Monday. The scene in Gaza, of course, pretty horrific. We saw several buildings destroyed. In fact, one building, which has been described as a bank associated with Hamas, has been destroyed. And of course, many people injured, many people wounded, and many people have lost their lives in the fighting in Gaza as well. The death toll there, at least 120 people. Over here in Israel, the death toll, we understand, is 8 or more people as well. And those numbers just keep rising as this conflict continues. Now, I should say that I had a conversation earlier today with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's chief advisor and spokesman, a man by the name of Mark Regev, who some of our viewers may be familiar with. I was asking Mr. Regev that what's going to happen? Is this going to continue? You know, you have to look back at 2014, and that war lasted 50 days. Is that going to happen here? Now, he wouldn't commit to any kind of timeline, but he did say that the fighting was going to continue in full force. Tanya.
Imtiaz, that's interesting because my next question was going to be whether or not you got a sense there was any talk of a ceasefire in the works, but it sounds as if we got our answer there. It sounds as if there is not.
Well, look, a lot of people want a ceasefire. We know that the U.S. has sent diplomats to try to push Israel into agreeing one with Hamas. We understand that Egypt has been trying to push Hamas to offer a ceasefire to Israel. And it does seem that Hamas did offer that ceasefire. But the thing is, we also have confirmation that Israel refused, again, from Mr. Regev, who we had that conversation with. He's saying that Israel was not going going to accept any ceasefire, despite the fact that so many countries around the world are saying that's what's needed. You have the United Nations calling for the same thing, the European Union, but Israel standing firm, saying that it's going to continue fighting. But all of that, of course, is just going to cause misery, not only here in Israel, but certainly in Gaza. We have to remember, this is a tiny, tiny area, densely populated. In fact, Britain's former Prime Minister Tony Blair described it as, David Cameron described it as an open-air prison. And that is where Israel and its sophisticated weaponry, its sophisticated military hardware has been targeting in a force that we just haven't seen in a very long time. And the fact that we aren't going to see any kind of ceasefire anytime soon, at least according to the Israeli government, means that that enclave full of all those people, many, of course, are civilians, not all people in Gaza are Hamas. We're just going to see more suffering and more devastation. But, of course, we're also going to see more Hamas rocket flying into Israel. And that, of course, is a cause for concern, not only here in Israel and indeed in the Palestinian territories, but for the world as well. Tanya.
All right. Well, Imtiaz Tyab in Tel Aviv, stay safe and thank you for your reporting.